It's been officially 12 years since the 9/11 terrorist attacks happened in New York City and Washington, D.C. And since that time, we've faced the global war on terror, the wars in the Middle East, the loss of civil liberties at home, and the global financial collapse and crisis. Did you know that the third tower fell in New York City on 9/11, 7 hours after the Twin Towers collapsed? And did you know that that building fell at near free fall speed? Did you hear about the dozens of eyewitness reporters from first responders about the secondary explosive noises going off before the World Trade Center towers collapsed? In this episode of Freedom Free for All, we interviewed two prominent 9/11 truth activists from Victoria to hear their opinions on 9/11. I'm Greg Hill with wearechange.victoria.org. And we're here with Elizabeth Woodsworth and Brian Burchill. Elizabeth represents years of study and knowledge and research into 9/11. Elizabeth was the senior research assistant for David Ray Griffin, who has published over 7 books and has received 3 Nobel Peace Prize nominations for his books. Elizabeth is also the co-founder of the 9/11 Consensus Panel. Elizabeth, it's nice to be with you.
Thank you, Greg.
Brian Burchill, he's a mechanical engineer, and he is a published author on 9/11. And I wanted to talk to the two of you today to dive a little bit deeper. So, Elizabeth, could you start off and tell us a little bit about architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth?
Yes. Architect Richard Gage, who lives in San Francisco, one day he heard Dr. Griffin talking on the radio, and Griffin was describing the fall of the buildings, how they fell so quickly. And Gage suddenly realized that he had seen that in his subconscious mind, but he never really thought about it. And he went home and he watched the buildings drop, and he decided to start an organization called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. And that was back in 2006. And since then, with his world lectures and his wonderful website and all the promotion he has done to raise public awareness, he now has over 2,000 architects and engineers calling for a new investigation into 9/11.
So, this day, it's coming up on the 12th anniversary of 9/11, and they have started a new project called rethink911.org. And Brian, maybe you could tell us a little bit about this project.
Yes, it's they've raised funds, $225,000 at least, to set up advertising campaigns in a dozen cities at least around the world. They have large billboards set up, like in Times Square, a 54-foot high billboard right in Times Square in New York, and other cities around the world, in Sydney, Australia, in right here in Vancouver, British Columbia, Ottawa, Toronto. What else? We have Washington, Boston, and in London, England, San Diego, San Francisco, Dallas, Chicago. They've set up these billboards, and as well as advertising campaigns on buses and taxis. There's others, such as Victoria. We also have a billboard. And other cities too have some billboards. Ours is located out on the Pat Bay Highway, just about 1.5 kilometers north of Island View Road, on the east side, on the right-hand side going north. And it mentions on the billboard is trying to raise the issue about the third tower, the World Trade Center 7, that a lot of people are not aware of, that also collapsed on September 11th.
So the campaign is centered primarily around raising awareness for World Trade Center 7.
That seems to be the case, yes. Yeah.
So maybe you could explain to the audience why this is so significant.
Yes, that collapse is particularly significant. They tend to call it the Achilles heel in the whole story of what happened in New York on September the 11th, 2001. That building clearly fell in free fall. First of all, it didn't fall in the morning along with the Twin Towers. They fell at 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning roughly. This one fell in the afternoon at about 5:25 in the afternoon on the same day. But it was never struck by an aircraft. It stood there all day long. There were some small office fires in that building, but then at 5:25 or so, it just suddenly collapsed in free fall. That is unequivocal. It was free fall, and the significance of that is that for a building to collapse in free fall means no resistance, means its entire structure, supporting structure, was removed simultaneously, which means it could then fall freely, just like a bowling ball being dropped free through the air. And that's very significant. The only way a building can fall freely is if all the structure has been removed, which means controlled demolition. And that's a very, very careful science, I guess I'll call it. Only a few people in the world can do this, that with such a large building, to do it so accurately.
So Elizabeth, this has become one of the focus areas for the 9/11 consensus panel. Maybe you could speak to this a little bit as well.
Yes, the 9/11 consensus panel is composed of 24 specialists who've been looking into 9/11 for the last decade. And 2 years ago, we formed ourselves into a reviewing body which uses the same techniques for reviewing our consensus statements that are used in medicine to guide physician practice around the world. These bodies get together in panels, and they review through a blind method where they don't talk to each other. They independently review evidence. And this is what we've done. We've been doing it across the board on aspects of what the official story of 9/11 claims. And we now have 37 consensus points. And today, this is September 8th, we're publishing 5 new ones. And one of them is about the attempt on behalf of the government, NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, to explain what happened to this building. They worked on it for 7 years. They started about 2002. FEMA first did a study, which was actually quite an honest study in some respects. And then NIST was the whitewash job. They took over, and they spent 7 years trying to figure out how they could present this falling building that fell just as fast as a brick. Like the whole roof line was straight across the top. The whole thing just fell straight down. And so they worked on computer simulation models. And they finally came up with a model which is just a joke. It's on the cover of the report. And it's twisted and irregular, deformed building, which is not consistent with what we see if we go to YouTube and watch any number of photographs or video footage of this building coming down.
So they ran into trouble then because they had an initial draft report that stated that the collapse of World Trade Center 7 was not due to, did not fall at free fall acceleration.
That's right. And because if it did, that implied explosives. But then one of our panelists, David Chandler, challenged them. He's a physics teacher, and he created a model that showed that the top floors of the building, the first 2.25 seconds, were in absolute free fall before they met the lower floor resistance. And once that David Chandler had presented this information, NIST had to change its final report to show that the building was in free fall, but they held on to their claim that it dropped because of office fires.
So that's significant. So they changed the report saying that at first it did not collapse at free fall, but then they were forced by the evidence of third-party observers that they had to admit that it did collapse at free fall speed. And they're hanging on to this assertion that fire was responsible for this. But has fire ever brought down a building, a steel frame building, due to fire previously? And Brian, maybe we could come to you.
My understanding is that no, it has never happened. A steel frame structure has never been brought down by fire before. And there are all kinds of examples. You can Google them on the web and find them of various high skyscrapers around the world that did burn, and raging infernos in some cases that went on for many, many hours, sometimes a day or two of just raging inferno, and gutted the entire building. And when the fire was finally put out, the steel frame structure, and sometimes concrete as well, was still standing there. They did not collapse. In this case, World Trade Center 7, it was nowhere near the amount of heat. There were small office fires. There was no raging inferno. And yet the building NIST claimed that the building collapsed due to those fires, which is nonsensical, absolute nonsense. They tried to make, when they changed and admitted that it was free fall, that shows that their work was faulty, because you can't have an office fire and have free fall. The one contradicts the other. If you have an office fire, you would then have a gradual collapse in sections and pieces and so on. You would not have, as Elizabeth explained, just a complete, smooth, free fall. You don't get that with an office fire. But even if a steel frame building could collapse due to office fires, it wouldn't fall like that.
So from World Trade Center 7, then, the premise behind this rethink911.org billboard project is the question: did you know a third tower fell on 9/11? So most people haven't even heard of this building, and in that significance, with the collapse that was reevaluated and reported as a collapse due to fire at free fall speed from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, how would that translate into what the observable and empirical evidence is from the Twin Towers? Elizabeth, perhaps you could speak to the Twin Towers.
The Twin Towers didn't fall quite as fast. They were a lot taller. They were 110 stories tall, whereas Building 7 was 47 stories. And the Twin Towers came down just a little bit slower, but they still had all the features of a controlled demolition in that they came straight down. If you can imagine a 110-story building being hit by a plane, you would think that it would topple or fall into other buildings. But this thing was so carefully engineered that they were able to drop them straight, and the squibs were coming out. One of the characteristics of a controlled demolition is that squibs of dust come out through the windows, shatter as the building's coming down, and the squibs come out. They were clearly visible in the footage of the Twin Towers falling. In fact, the Twin Towers, if you look carefully on YouTube, you see them almost explode, like the dust and debris goes up and outwards like this. It's not just a rapid straight down descent.
So would the justification that NIST uses is that the impact and the jet fuel caused the collapse? Perhaps you could expand on that.
Yeah, there's a problem with that story, a serious problem, and that is that the amount of energy that and the impact of a jet and the fuel that burned, the amount of energy is there's an energy imbalance in what the official story is saying, that the impact of the aircraft and the burning fuel was what caused the collapse. There was far more energy required to collapse those buildings than an aircraft could supply. Another thing is the jet fuel itself does not burn at a temperature high enough to melt steel. It also burned for a very short period of time. There was a huge fireball, as we all know, and most of the fuel was burned up in that fireball, which lasted for seconds. So the amount of heat, which was inadequate to melt the steel, didn't stay there for very long. It was gone. What fuel burned later on the floors, it was oxygen starved, and so could not reach a very high temperature as well. How do we know it was oxygen starved? Because we all remember the billows of smoke coming out of those buildings as they burned, and the office furniture and so on was burning as well. And so an oxygen-starved fire is a cool fire. So what all this adds up to is that there was not enough heat. There was not a high enough temperature in those buildings to have melted the steel. Something else has to have caused the steel to fail. And by energy analysis of the whole collapse, there has to have been another source of energy, a lot of energy. And that has been found, evidence of that. A Danish scientist, Dr. Niels Harrit, led a team of, I think it was 9 scientists, And they analyzed the dust from the collapse of those twin towers, and clear evidence that the dust is laden with the very small particles of a material, two materials, one called thermite and another thermate, and they are they are very high temperature incendiaries, not necessarily explosive, but incendiaries. They, thermate particularly, once it ignites, it is at temperature of about 4,000 degrees and more than enough to melt steel, which melts at about 2,700 degrees. And so they found the evidence when there's any kind of a rapid burn or explosion, because there have to have been explosions as well, and that would have thrown some of the unignited thermate and thermite out into the dust, and that's what was left over, is the residue from the explosions. And also what indicates that there was an extremely high temperature in the buildings is what they call microspheres, molten steel. It's just like a spray bottle of water, you mist it. Well, steel, when it's molten and there's an explosion, it then mists and it forms little droplets. And the dust of World Trade Center 7 is laden with these microspheres of molten steel.
Wait, you said molten steel.
Molten steel. So there has to have been a very, very high temperature in those buildings to cause the steel to melt. And the jet fuel does not provide enough energy, enough temperature to do that. There had to have been something else. And Dr. Harrett and his team found something in the dust that could have done that. And that's the thermate and thermite.
So you actually have a scientifically produced documentary and DVD in front of you. And this is the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth.
Correct, yeah.
Film called Experts Speak Out.
Yes.
So these are available in Victoria for free. We'd be happy to share these with anybody that writes in. And you can look at the scientific video evidence for yourself as it's laid out by ae911truth.org.
Yes, they interview quite a few scientists, architects, engineers, various other professionals are interviewed and it's on this DVD. There's a huge amount of expert opinion about what occurred that day, and a great deal of this analysis and opinion refutes much of the official story. This is the important thing. There was an official story put out by the U.S. government and agencies of the government, but the evidence does not support those stories. This is what that's why it's all called about 9/11 Truth. Yes, there were investigations. Yes, there was a 9/11 commission, but they haven't told us the truth. What we have been told defies laws of science. The scientists, the engineers who know science are telling us that the official version has some serious flaws in it, and we haven't been told the truth. Why haven't we? We need to know the truth. Unfortunately, the untruth that we've been told is the cause of a lot of the wars that have been going on since 2001. And there's the Iraq war and so on, and now the Syrian war. The Syrian war is tied into this misinformation that we're given about the official version of what happened in 2001.
So what we've heard from today's discussion is that this evidence refutes the official 9/11 conspiracy theory that was put forward by the government and the National Institute for Standards and Technology. Now, Elizabeth, is there anything else that you wanted to add to the conversation?
Yes, there are two new consensus points that deal with, one of the first deals with the seismic data that was recorded that day. The seismographs were running while the buildings were hit and when they collapsed. And the 9/11 Commission report said that the seismic data, there were two sets of it that showed waves related to the planes hitting the towers and then the towers collapsing. But later on, it was shown that the seismic data, there have been some experts working on this in France, and they have proved that seismic data did not relate to the times when the planes hit the towers and when they collapsed. Rather, it related to times when there were massive explosions in the sub-basements. And those explosions were reported by dozens and hundreds of people who were on the ground outside and felt the ground shake. And the other thing that this correlates to is that they found rivers of running molten metal deep down under the towers soon after. And they found them immediately, and they This molten metal was being seen for weeks afterwards. They'd pulled the great girders that had been sort of plunged into the ground. They'd pull them out with cranes, and they'd be dripping orange metal. The people that were working on the debris piles, wearing their boots, they were melting. And this was weeks later. And so we need to understand what happened to heat that debris pile so high up, for so long afterwards. And this might be explained by the nanothermite that Brian was talking about, these incendiary chips that were found all through the dust. Those have their own source of energy. That's one speculation.
And as well, in the actual 9/11 Commission report, they did not address any of the testimony, eyewitness testimony, of explosives being heard. And from what my accounts is that there were over 100 firefighters and first responders that gave raw, real-time testimony on 9/11 that they heard explosives and secondary explosive noises.
That's right, and those were all posted to the New York Times website. They're available. It's called the Oral Histories of the 9/11 First Responders. Anybody can read them.
But those were not in the 9/11 Commission report.
No. They had the evidence, but they didn't use it. They did not publish it.
So that eyewitness testimony wasn't important to them?
It wasn't part of what they wanted to tell us.
And this is a pattern of what we've been seeing, this pattern of lies, this pattern of motive to create a situation where they can beat the war drums and point out a bad guy from overseas so that the United States can stay in perpetual war. And in this day and age, we have Syria as a current example of the United States beating those war drums. And how does this relate to what's going on in this day and age?
Well, the fallout from 9/11, it's been a most useful event in the Middle East. And General Wesley Clark told us back in 2006 that his Pentagon friends had told him that they were going to, right after 9/11, he went in to see his old buddies in the Pentagon. He was retired. And he said, they told me that they were planning to take out 7 Middle Eastern countries in the next 5 years. And he mentioned Libya and Syria and others. So now it's Syria's turn. And I went to listen. I had never seen the president of Syria, Bashar Assad. I'd never seen him on TV. And I went to YouTube and listened to some German interviews of him. And he is a British-trained medical doctor. He was second in line. When his father died, up until that time, he had been second in line. He had no interest in politics. He never went to visit his father in his office. The older brother was supposed to take charge when the dad died. And the older brother was killed in a car accident. So Dr. Assad had to take this job of leading Syria. And he married, in London, he married a British-born lovely woman who has humanitarian awards for her work helping people. And these two people are running Syria, and there's so much rebel. The contrived situation is that people from outside Syria are creating a civil war. And yesterday, 12 former CIA and NSA people and top military intelligence people went together, and they wrote an open letter to Obama saying that though these guys are former, and women, they're former employees in these CIA positions, they have been talking to the people who are currently in the structure, and there is no valid intelligence that the August 21st chemical attack outside Damascus was conducted by President Assad. That there's no intelligence, and they haven't been able to broadcast any. So this is looking very much like a false flag operation in the same tradition as 9/11.
So that's a very excellent series of points that you make, Elizabeth. You know, this pattern of behavior that we've seen from the United States of using deception to incite war. with the weapons of mass destruction that Colin Powell testified to Congress that they had in Iraq, lie. With the anthrax that they had after 9/11, and with the scope of these lies and propaganda to incite war and war profiteering, it is not only destroying the United States, but it's destroying the fabric of humanity in a lot of ways, and we need to take that power back. And so it's so important. I'm curious, maybe Brian, you could tell us why these issues are so significant to you, and why you're doing this work on 9/11.
Well, it's I should say that deceptions. What's being found out after the fact is that so many of these military actions have been supported by deception, false information. I think of Kuwait as another example. It turned out that what finally turned the American public in favor of going to war against Kuwait was a false piece of news of the Iraqi soldiers taking babies out of incubators and throwing them on the floor in Kuwait. There was testimony by a young lady that claimed to have been a nurse, and turned out she wasn't. This was all staged by a public relations firm in the United States in New York, and it was just staged to try to get people to support the idea of going to war. And so it bothers me to keep hearing these various stories. You mentioned the Colin Powell and his testimony. There's so much falsehood, and so therefore I have huge suspicion of whether or not there's valid justification to go to war against Syria. I just have serious doubt that there is.
Thank you very much, Brian. And Elizabeth, how about you? Why are these issues so significant to you?
I suppose the main reason is that I hope that one day humanity will live in a united globe where we can look upon each other as they look upon us from outer space. That's been the dream since we could see this whole planet. And 9/11 has done more than anything else to rip the thing down the middle. It's just severed relations between East and West in a way that the only way to cure it is to go back and look at 9/11 and see that it's a big lie, and go back to where we started and resume negotiations to heal this planet.
And to our audience, we'd ask you to visit consensus911.org and rethink911.org to review this information for yourself. Or please, by all means, contact Freedom Free for All or We Are Change Victoria to get a free copy of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truths, Blueprint for Truth. We will send you a copy of this DVD. Elizabeth, Brian, thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, in light of this information, of hearing about World Trade Center 7, a 47-story skyscraper that fell into its own footprint in 8 seconds, what do you think about 9/11? Do you have anybody in your family that's ever talked to you about 9/11? If you're interested in getting involved, join the millions of people around the world that are challenging the official 9/11 conspiracy, and join us for a new investigation into 9/11. It's been 12 years. It's time. I'm Greg Hill with WeAreChangeVictoria.org and Freedom Free for All TV. Be safe and be free.